The unlikely meeting. The Epsilon horizon was an impressive sight, one that made even the most seasoned crew members pause in awe. Floating silently in the depths of space, its hull was a testament to human ingenuity. A colossal ship, designed to be the flagship of a new era of intergalactic diplomacy, the Epsilon horizon carried not only human technology, but also the weight of an ambitious future. Its mission was as bold as it was critical. Humanity's first foray into an alliance with the Thraxians, a species of formidable warriors who had once regarded humans as insignificant at best, expendable at worst. For Lieutenant Commander Juno Masters, however, the significance of the mission was not what troubled her. What had caused her unease was the part of the mission that she could not have prepared for, living alongside a Thraxian warrior. She had grown accustomed to the silence of her own quarters, the solitude that came with being an engineer who spent long hours in the labyrinth of mechanical guts and circuitry that kept ships like the Epsilon horizon running smoothly. But this was different. She would now have to share space with one of the very beings whose culture she had only studied from a distance. Juno was an exceptional engineer, a human who had solved crises that had once stumped even the brightest minds of Earth. But she knew that solving mechanical problems was far simpler than navigating the complexities of an interspecies relationship. And the Thraxians, with their deep sense of pride, their unyielding martial culture, and their rigid traditions, were not exactly known for being warm or accommodating. It was more than just sharing a room. It was a test of humanity's place in the galaxy, and of whether a species as diverse and unpredictable as the Thraxians could ever find common ground with the humans they had once deemed primitive. The orders had come down from the top. For the sake of the Alliance, you will share quarters with a Thraxian. Simple, direct, and coldly efficient. Juno's mind had spun with possibilities as she made her way to her new living space. What would her new roommate be like? Would they even speak to each other? Would it be possible to create a space where they could coexist, or would she be left to navigate the tension of two completely different worlds colliding inside one small, enclosed room? The door to the quarters slid open with a soft hiss, and Juno stepped inside, immediately taking in the space. It was small, no more than a few meters wide, with 2 beds, a desk, and a small kitchenette tucked away in one corner. What struck her immediately was the stark contrast in the way the room had been arranged. On her side of the room, her personal gear was organized neatly, tools, gadgets, and blueprints scattered across her desk, all in their designated places. But the other side, it was another world entirely. A dark corner of the room had been transformed into a space that spoke of the Thraxian warrior culture. The walls were adorned with intricate tapestries woven from what looked like dark, shimmering fibers. In the center of the room stood a massive, gleaming suit of armor, polished to perfection. Weapons, unlike anything Juno had ever seen, were lined up meticulously on a small table, each one reflecting the soft light that filtered into the room. A woven mat lay beneath the armor, and beside it, what appeared to be ceremonial artifacts. Stones and relics carved with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the low light. This was no mere warrior's gear. It was a tribute, a homage to a culture that had stood the test of time through strength and honor. And then, standing in front of the window, his back turned to her, was the Thraxian. Even from behind, Juno could tell he was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and encased in armor that made him seem even larger than he was. His skin, a deep shade of bronze, seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and his posture was straight and rigid, like a soldier at attention. There was no room for softness in a Thraxian. Juno knew that much. But what else could she expect? Theirs was a society built on honor, and honor came with a certain level of pride. Pride that perhaps couldn't easily accommodate the likes of a human engineer. "Excuse me," Juno said, her voice firm but tinged with curiosity. She had no idea what to expect in this first moment of contact, but she had prepared herself for it. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Juno Masters. It seems we're going to be sharing these quarters for the duration of the mission." The Thraxian turned slowly, his amber eyes meeting hers with a gaze that was piercing, as though assessing her very soul. His expression was unreadable, a mask of indifference that seemed to shield everything beneath. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rich with authority. "I am Torek Varang," he said. His accent was guttural, each word wrapped in a deep cadence. "I do not share quarters with others. This is an arrangement I did not request." Juno stood her ground, feeling the weight of his gaze, but her mind raced with questions. How would they coexist? Could they? She wasn't just an engineer on this mission. She was humanity's face, a symbol of the species' strength and resilience. If she failed, humanity's place in the galaxy would be in jeopardy. "I didn't request it either," she replied. "But we'll make it work. I'm sure we'll find a way to adapt." Torek's eyes narrowed slightly, the only sign of a shift in his otherwise stoic demeanor. He regarded her for a long moment, his gaze flickering to the tools and equipment scattered across the room, a subtle judgment there that he did not bother to mask. Yet there was something else in his eyes. A challenge, perhaps, or a curiosity. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Adaptation," Torek said slowly, his voice taking on a contemplative tone. "Perhaps, but I do not expect peace in this arrangement. It will take more than mere adaptation to survive in a shared space." Juno felt a pang of apprehension, but she refused to show it. She had faced challenges before, big challenges. This would be no different. She had to prove, not only to herself but to him and to the universe, that humans could adapt, could learn, could build bridges where there had been walls. "We don't have to like each other," Juno said, "but we will make this work. For the mission. For humanity." Torek didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to his corner of the room, a silent signal that the conversation was over, at least for now. Juno exhaled deeply and took a seat on the bed closest to her desk. The sound of Torek's quiet movements as he adjusted his armor filled the space between them. And for a long time, neither spoke. But Juno was thinking, planning. She knew this was just the beginning. The mission, the alliance, and perhaps even the future of humanity itself rested on her ability to navigate this strange new reality. She would learn what she needed to survive, just as she always had. After all, adaptability was humanity's greatest strength. And as she glanced at Torek's unmoving form, she realized that in a way, she was already learning. Uneasy beginnings. The days that followed their first meeting were tense, to say the least. Juno and Torek had settled into an uneasy routine, with each acknowledging the other's presence without truly engaging. It was as though they were two separate worlds occupying the same small space, too close to ignore, but too different to understand. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the sounds of their work or the occasional clink of Torek's armor as he moved with careful precision, always aware of his surroundings. Juno had expected this, at least in part. She had trained for the technical aspects of her job, solving problems with machinery, making critical repairs, and maintaining the integrity of the ship. But this was different. This wasn't about fixing circuits or ensuring the power systems ran smoothly. This was about fixing a rift that spanned galaxies. This was about two cultures that had never coexisted, let alone cooperated, forced to share quarters and a mission for the sake of something bigger. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than anything she had carried before. She had hoped for a moment of connection, a breakthrough where perhaps they would speak honestly, or even share something personal. But Torek was an enigma. He remained closed off, distant, almost like a shadow in the room. He would wake early each morning before Juno and disappear into the corner where his armor and weapons lay. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if every action was part of some larger, deeply ingrained practice that Juno could never quite understand. The only time he spoke was when necessary, his words measured and blunt. His voice carried an authority that made it impossible for Juno to ignore him, but she sensed that he was just as unwilling to acknowledge her presence, unless absolutely necessary. Every time their eyes met, there was an unspoken challenge between them, like two warriors circling each other, waiting for the other to make the first move. For Juno, the silence was suffocating. She was used to isolation. But not like this. Not with someone so different from her. Someone who seemed to carry an entire culture of discipline and honor on his shoulders. And yet she couldn't help but be intrigued. Torek's stoicism was impenetrable, and his pride, though evident, was wrapped in layers of something deeper, something unspoken that Juno was dying to understand. It was the third day after their arrival on the Epsilon horizon, when the ship was struck by an unexpected tremor, jolting the entire crew awake. The emergency lights flashed to life, casting a red glow across the room, and alarms blared throughout the vessel. Instinctively, Juno sprang from her bed, reaching for the tools she kept nearby. Her mind raced through a checklist of possible scenarios: system malfunction, a breach in the hull, a sudden attack. Whatever it was, she had to act fast. Torek was already up, his movements swift and purposeful. Without a word, he moved to the weapons table, pulling a blade from its sheath and strapping it to his side. Juno watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen him move like this. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt. He was ready for whatever threat had caused the ship's sudden upheaval. "Stay here," Torek said, his voice sharp, though it held no malice. "I will investigate." Juno shook her head. "We need to stick together. If there's a breach or some kind of sabotage, you can't handle it alone. We'll go together." Torek regarded her for a long moment, his amber eyes searching hers. For the first time since their initial meeting, he looked conflicted. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Was it doubt? Trust? It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it left Juno with an unsettling feeling. Still, he didn't protest. He simply nodded once and moved toward the door. Together, they navigated the darkened corridors of the Epsilon horizon, the ship's systems sputtering intermittently as they moved deeper into the heart of the vessel. The crew had already started to assemble in the central command area, but it was clear that the situation was still chaotic. Juno's mind raced, her thoughts moving faster than her feet. Whatever had caused the tremor, it was serious. And it was more than just a simple malfunction. The pair reached the central control room where Commander Vance, the human officer overseeing the mission, was barking orders to the crew. His eyes flicked over to Juno and Torek as they entered, but he didn't pause in his commands. "Report," he snapped at them. "We felt a tremor," Juno replied, trying to steady her voice. "Is it a hull breach? Sabotage?" Vance shook his head, his expression grim. "It's not sabotage. We've detected a significant energy fluctuation coming from one of the ship's lower sectors, far from the primary systems. We think it's a containment issue, possibly involving one of the experimental drives we've been testing. We're still gathering data." Juno's heart sank. The experimental drives were cutting-edge technology, designed to allow the ship to travel faster than anything humanity had ever created. If something went wrong with one of them, the consequences could be catastrophic. She glanced over at Torek, his expression unreadable, but his posture was tense. For all his stoic nature, Juno knew that the Thraxian warrior could feel the same unease she did. They were standing at the edge of something dangerous. "We'll need to check the drive systems," Juno said, her mind already racing through possible solutions. "If there's a containment failure, it could destabilize the entire sector." Torek's gaze locked onto her for a moment before he turned toward Vance. "We will go," he said, his voice unwavering. "Show us the way." Juno nodded, leading the way down another set of narrow, twisting corridors. As they moved deeper into the ship's lower levels, the air grew colder, and the hum of the engines became a low, ominous buzz. The containment room was just ahead, but Juno could already feel the pressure building in her chest. The situation was worse than she had feared. They were nearing a critical point, and if they didn't act quickly, the Epsilon horizon could be lost. They arrived at the containment chamber, where a team of engineers was already hard at work. A flickering console showed signs of a major power drain, and the lights above them blinked in and out. The containment field that had been keeping the energy of the experimental drive stable was beginning to fail. Juno quickly joined the engineers at the console, her fingers flying over the interface as she worked to stabilize the field. Torak stood at her side, watching her with silent intensity. She could feel his presence, but it wasn't threatening. Instead, there was a quiet respect in the way he observed her, as if, for the first time, he was seeing her as something more than just another human. "Can you stabilize it?" Torak asked, his voice low, yet filled with a strange urgency. Juno's brow furrowed as she focused on the screen. "I'm doing my best, but I'm going to need more time." She glanced up at him. "Can you assist me?" For a moment, Torak didn't move. Then, without a word, he stepped closer, his massive hands working alongside hers, expertly manipulating the console and making adjustments with an efficiency that surprised her. Though they had spent little time together, there was something about the way he worked, his precision, his focus, that told Juno that he was far more than just a soldier. He was a warrior in every sense of the word, but there was also a quiet intelligence beneath his hardened exterior. Together, they worked in harmony, human ingenuity and Thraxian discipline combining in a way that neither of them had expected. It wasn't just about fixing the containment breach. It was about something bigger. In that moment, Juno realized that this was the beginning of something more than just survival. It was the beginning of cooperation, an unspoken understanding between two very different beings. And for the first time since their mission had begun, Juno felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this alliance than she had ever imagined. Bonds forged in fire. The days following the containment breach passed in a blur of activity. The Epsilon horizon had been temporarily stabilized, but the tension aboard the ship remained high. Engineers worked around the clock to ensure the integrity of the experimental drive, while the crew members, still rattled by the close call, tried to regain their composure. For Juno and Torak, however, the aftermath of the event was more than just a crisis averted. It was a turning point, a moment that marked the beginning of a strange, tentative understanding between them. Juno couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. The way she and Torak had worked together, seamlessly combining their knowledge and skills, had been unexpected. It wasn't just that they had fixed the containment breach, it was how they had done it. There had been no hesitation between them, no fighting for control or trying to prove superiority. They had simply worked, and for the first time, Juno began to wonder if there was more to the Thraxian warrior than the cold, stoic exterior he had shown her up until that point. As the days wore on, Juno found herself engaging with Torak more than she had planned. At first, it was purely out of necessity. They were assigned to monitor the ship's systems together, ensuring that no further issues arose after the breach. But soon, the awkward silences between them began to wane. It was as though the shared experience of almost losing the ship had created an invisible thread between them, a thread that neither could ignore. One evening, as Juno sat at her desk, meticulously reviewing the ship's diagnostics, Torak approached her from across the room. His footsteps were silent, but she could feel his presence, as if the very air around him was charged with a quiet energy. Juno looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. His amber gaze was unreadable, but there was something different about it now, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. "I have been studying the human systems," Torak said, his voice as steady as ever. "Your engineering methods are efficient." Juno blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. She hadn't expected such a remark from someone like him, especially after all the cool indifference he had shown her in the past. "Thank you," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral, though she couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at her lips. "I've spent years working with technology. It's all about understanding the patterns, the flow of energy, the connections." Torak nodded, though his expression remained stoic. "I see. In my culture, there is no room for error. Every movement, every decision must be deliberate. We do not allow for inefficiency." Juno's smile faded slightly. She had heard about the Thraxian way of life, their focus on precision, honor, and perfection. But she had never really understood it until now. To them, every action had to be flawless, every choice carefully calculated. It was a way of life that seemed both rigid and powerful, a mindset that valued strength above all else. "That sounds exhausting," Juno remarked, her voice softening with empathy. "To never make mistakes, to always be perfect. That must weigh on you." For a brief moment, Torek's gaze flickered with something unreadable. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by his usual cool detachment. "Perfection is the only way to ensure survival," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Weakness leads to failure, and failure leads to death." Juno felt a shiver run down her spine at his words, but she quickly masked it. She had known that the Thraxians were a warrior race, but hearing it from Torek, so matter-of-factly, made her realize just how different their world was from her own. For him, there was no room for failure, no space for compassion or understanding. It was a harsh existence, one built on the belief that only the strong deserved to survive. "And what about the rest of us?" Juno asked quietly, her voice laced with a hint of challenge. "What about those who are not warriors? The engineers, the diplomats, the thinkers? Where do we fit into your world?" Torek regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Juno held his gaze, unwilling to look away. It was an uncomfortable silence, one that stretched on longer than she anticipated. But eventually, Torek spoke, his voice softer than before, though still firm. "Strength comes in many forms," he said, his words measured. "The warrior's strength is in combat, but the engineer's strength lies in the ability to create, to build, to sustain life. You are not weak, Juno Masters. You are strong in your own way." Juno was taken aback by his words. There was a subtle shift in the air between them, a moment of understanding that she hadn't expected. She had always believed that strength was defined by physical power, by the ability to fight and win. But here, now, Torek was telling her that strength could come in other forms, forms she had never considered. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice softer than she intended. I never thought of it that way." Torek nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though considering something. "You may not understand this, Juno, but your kind has a strength that we do not possess. Your adaptability, your ability to change and grow. It is a strength I have come to respect." Juno blinked, surprised by the admission. For someone like Torek, whose pride and discipline were so deeply ingrained, admitting respect for another species was no small thing. And yet, there it was, an acknowledgement of her strength, of the strength of humanity itself. The moment lingered, hanging between them like a delicate thread. Juno wasn't sure what to say next, but she knew that something had shifted between them. They weren't allies yet, not in the truest sense of the word, but there was a new understanding, a quiet respect that had begun to form in the aftermath of their shared experience. It was the first step, and Juno wasn't sure where it would lead, but she was willing to find out. As the days passed, Juno and Torek continued to work together, their interactions becoming less strained, more fluid. There were still moments of tension, still moments when the differences between them felt insurmountable. But there were also moments of collaboration, where they shared their knowledge and their skills, working toward a common goal. One evening, as they sat side by side in the control room, reviewing the ship's systems, Torek spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Juno," he began, his words slow, as though carefully choosing them. "I have been considering your species. You are not as I expected." Juno raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How so?" Torek's gaze met hers, and for the first time, There was a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, a brief glimpse into the depths of the warrior that he kept so tightly controlled. "You're kind. You are not as focused on power as we are, but you have something more. Your strength is in your ability to endure, to adapt, to learn. It is a different kind of power, one that I did not understand until now." Juno felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, though she quickly masked it. She had known that humans had something unique to offer, something that set them apart from other species. But hearing it from Torek, in such a direct and honest way, made her realize just how far they had come, from reluctant roommates to something more. "I think," she said softly, her eyes meeting his, "that we might be able to teach each other something after all." Torek nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Perhaps. We shall see." In that moment, Juno knew that the journey they had begun was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, difficult moments, misunderstandings, and clashes of culture. But as she looked at Torek, she realized that there was something more powerful than strength alone. It was the ability to build something together, something that neither could have achieved on their own. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was where the true power lay. The unlikely alliance. The mission aboard the Epsilon Horizon had taken an unexpected turn in the days that followed. What had started as an uneasy partnership between Juno and Torek, a human engineer and a Thraxian warrior, had now evolved into something much more complex, something neither had anticipated. They weren't just coexisting anymore. They were beginning to understand each other, their differences no longer an insurmountable wall, but rather a bridge to something greater. And yet, despite the progress, they both knew that their journey together was far from simple. The ship had settled into a cautious routine after the containment breach. The engineers, alongside Torek, had made significant strides in stabilizing the experimental drives. But for Juno, the most critical aspect of the mission was the work she did alongside the Thraxian warrior. Despite their growing mutual respect, there were still challenges in working with someone so fundamentally different. One evening, Juno was reviewing the diagnostic reports in her quarters when Torek entered, as he often did now. The days of awkward silences had become fewer and fewer. He walked in, as always, with the same purposeful stride, his imposing figure filling the doorway. But today, there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of determination that caught her attention. "Juno," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "I need your assistance." Juno looked up, intrigued. "What is it?" "There is a situation I cannot resolve alone. I require your expertise," Torek explained, his posture rigid but not unapproachable. "It is a matter of ship security, something I cannot handle with force alone." Juno furrowed her brow. "Security? I thought you handled all physical threats. What's going on?" Torek's jaw tightened, and for a moment, there was a flash of something like frustration in his expression, but it disappeared quickly. "There are inconsistencies in the ship's log. Someone has tampered with the systems. There are traces of a code, an unknown signature that is not registered to any crew member." Juno stood up from her desk, immediately alert. A security breach. Her mind raced through possibilities. If someone was trying to sabotage the mission, it could put everything at risk. She couldn't ignore it, especially not when it involved the delicate alliance with the Thraxians. "I'll help you," she said, her voice firm. "We'll track it down together." They worked in silence as they made their way to the ship's central security room. Juno's fingers flew across the interface, her eyes scanning the data streams with intense focus. Torek stood behind her, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over her workstation. He didn't say much, but Juno could feel his presence, steady, watchful, always ready. "What do you think?" she asked, as the data began to unfold in front of them. The code signature was unlike anything she'd seen before. It wasn't human, but it wasn't Thraxian either. It was something foreign, the third party. Torek's eyes narrowed as he leaned closer, studying the screen with a level of intensity that matched her own. "I believe this is a deliberate act of sabotage," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with the weight of his conclusion. "The signature is too specific, too calculated to be random." Juno's heart sank. This wasn't just a simple malfunction. Someone was trying to disrupt the mission, and it could lead to disastrous consequences. She worked faster, bypassing security protocols and digging deeper into the code. The more she uncovered, the more the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. It was clear now. Whoever had done this had access to the highest levels of the ship's systems. "We need to find the source," Juno muttered, frustration lacing her words. "If they're inside the system, they're already in position to strike." Torek's gaze flickered over the data, his face a study of concentration. For a moment, Juno saw something shift in his demeanor, a quiet determination. It was the same look he had worn during the containment breach, when they had worked together to save the ship. She didn't know if it was his warrior instinct or something more, but he was committed to this, just as she was. "I will track the intruder on the ground," Torek said, his voice low. "You will cover me from here. Together, we will find the traitor." Juno hesitated for only a moment before nodding. This was no longer just about securing the ship. It was about trust. Torek had always been the one to take the lead in matters of physical confrontation, but now they were working as equals. She wasn't just an engineer anymore. She was his partner in this mission, and she had the skills to match his intensity in her own way. "I'll guide you through the systems," she said. "We'll move fast and cover all possible access points." Torek turned to leave, his large frame moving with purpose toward the door. Juno followed him, her fingers once again flying over the interface, feeding him the information he needed in real time. The ship's internal layout appeared before her, highlighting the various security checkpoints, access panels, and maintenance corridors. She tracked Torek's movements through the ship, guiding him to each critical area. They were getting closer. Through the comms, she could hear Torek's voice, calm and precise as ever. "I'm in the lower levels now. There's a hidden access point here. I'll need to breach it." "Be careful," Juno warned, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. "If they're lying in wait, they'll be prepared for you." Torek's voice crackled over the comms, a slight edge to it. "I am always prepared." Juno's fingers hovered over the screen as she monitored his progress. Every step Torek took was measured and deliberate. She knew that the Thraxian warrior was never reckless. Every move he made was calculated, a product of years of training and discipline. But the threat they were dealing with was unlike any enemy Juno had ever faced. This wasn't just a rogue soldier or a rebellious crew member. This was something much bigger, something more dangerous. Suddenly, her screen blinked, the signal shifting. Torek's position was now within a few meters of the intruder's location. She guided him to the final access point, the last obstacle between them and the sabotage network. "Ready?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. "Always," Torek replied. In a flash, Torek moved. He used his strength and precision to break through the sealed door, his massive form bursting into the hidden compartment. Juno could hear the sounds of movement, the rustling of a struggle, but there was no panic in Torek's actions. He was in control. "Got him," Torek's voice came through the comms. "He's down." Juno breathed a sigh of relief, her heart pounding in her chest. The intruder had been caught, an unregistered officer from the ship's security detail, working alone. The sabotage attempts had been calculated, carefully designed to bring down the ship's systems at key moments. If left unchecked, it could have cost them everything. But now, thanks to their cooperation, the threat was neutralized. As Torek secured the intruder, Juno reviewed the data, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. They had done it. Together. When Torek returned to the control room, his expression remained as stoic as ever, but there was something in the way he looked at her now. It wasn't just the warrior's respect. It was something deeper, something that spoke of understanding, of trust built in the heat of battle. "You were effective," Torek said, his tone softer than it had been before. "You have proven your strength, Juno Masters." Juno nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. "We both did." For the first time since they had begun this mission together, Juno felt like they were more than just two individuals thrown together by circumstance. They were an alliance, an unexpected one. Yes, but one that was stronger because of their differences. Together, they had faced a challenge that neither could have overcome alone. And in doing so, they had forged a bond that was more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any rivalry. As the Epsilon Horizon continued its journey through the stars, Juno and Torak both knew that the path ahead would not be easy. But for the first time, they truly believed they could face it together. Two very different beings, united by the strength of their shared purpose. Unraveling the past, the Epsilon Horizon continued its steady course through the vast reaches of space, but the atmosphere aboard the ship had shifted in ways that neither Juno nor Torak could have predicted. What had once been an icy partnership, strained by distrust and wariness, had transformed into something deeper, a mutual understanding that both had been too cautious to embrace. They were no longer just two beings forced together by circumstance. They were allies, united by their shared experiences, each bringing something valuable to the table. However, as the days passed, a new challenge arose, one that neither of them had anticipated. The sabotage that they had discovered was only the beginning. The deeper Juno and Torak dug into the ship's systems, the more they uncovered. It was as if they had opened a door that led to a much darker, more intricate web of deceit. And the more they learned, the more questions arose. Who was truly behind the attacks? Why had they been targeting the Epsilon Horizon? And more importantly, what did they want? Juno sat at her desk, poring over the security logs once more. She had already gone through them multiple times, but every time she thought she had found the last clue, another detail would surface that forced her to look deeper. There was something off about the timing of the sabotage. It wasn't just random. It was too precise, too well planned. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to disable the ship. They were trying to prevent the alliance between humanity and the Thraxians from succeeding. Torak had become more involved in the investigation as well, his warrior instincts driving him to track down every lead, no matter how small. But Juno could tell that something was weighing on him. The intensity of their work together, the late nights spent analyzing data, had begun to take a toll. Torak's usual stoic demeanor seemed to crack at the edges, and every so often, Juno would catch him staring off into the distance, lost in thought. It was a look that troubled her. One evening, as the ship's artificial lights dimmed for rest hours, Juno found herself in the common area, taking a rare moment to stretch her legs. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Torak standing nearby until his voice broke the silence. "Juno," he said, his deep voice carrying an unusual weight, "we need to talk." Juno looked up, surprised. Torak rarely initiated conversations outside of their work, and when he did, it was usually related to the mission. She set down her datapad, giving him her full attention. "What's on your mind?" she asked, trying to mask the concern in her voice. Torak took a step closer, his amber eyes locked onto hers. There was a vulnerability there, a flicker of something buried deep within him. For a moment, Juno wasn't sure what to say, unsure if she was reading him correctly. But then, Torak spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I've been thinking," he began, "about my people, about the Thraxian culture and the way we view the galaxy. I have been trained to believe that strength is the only currency that matters, that there is no room for weakness, no space for compassion." Juno's brow furrowed as she listened carefully. She had never heard Torak speak like this before. His usual confidence had given way to something else, something raw. "But I see something in you, Juno," he continued, his words measured but with a quiet intensity. "Your strength, it is not the same as ours. It is not the strength of a warrior, but the strength of adaptability, of resilience. And I wonder, sometimes, if that is the true strength, the ability to survive in a world that constantly changes. Juno's heart skipped a beat at his words. There was no judgment in his tone, no challenge, just an observation. And suddenly, she understood what had been bothering him. Torak wasn't just struggling with their alliance, he was struggling with the very notion of change. The Thraxians had long believed in the rigidity of their ways. They valued structure, discipline, and tradition above all else. But what Juno was showing him, by simply existing as she did, was the power of flexibility, the strength found in growth and adaptation. "I've seen it in your people, too," Torak added, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his words carefully. "How you humans, you do not follow the same rules. You build, you destroy, you grow. You do not live by the same constraints, and yet you thrive. It is unlike anything we know." Juno paused, considering his words. She had always seen her own adaptability as a basic survival mechanism, something that came naturally to humanity. But to Torak, it was something almost foreign, something that challenged everything he had been taught. "I think," Juno said slowly, her voice steady, "that it's not about being rigid or flexible. It's about knowing when to adapt and when to stand your ground. Sometimes, the strength of a warrior lies not in defeating your opponent, but in understanding them. And sometimes, strength lies in the ability to listen, to learn from others, even when they seem completely different from you." Torak was silent for a long time, his gaze never leaving hers. For a brief moment, Juno felt as if they were two beings from entirely different worlds, separated by culture, by species, by history. And yet, here they were, standing on common ground, not as allies of convenience, but as something more, something complicated, yet undeniable. "You speak as if you are a diplomat," Torak remarked, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, though his eyes remained serious. "Perhaps your kind has more strength than we realize." Juno smiled back, though it was a small, fleeting thing. She didn't know where this path would lead, whether they would continue to forge a partnership that could stand the test of time, or whether their differences would eventually pull them apart. But for the first time, she didn't feel so uncertain. She felt that, whatever happened, they were stronger for having walked this road together. That night, as Juno returned to her quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had changed between her and Torak. There was a new depth to their connection, one that transcended their roles as human engineer and Thraxian warrior. But there was something else, too, something darker, something that neither of them could yet comprehend fully. The sabotage, the threats to their mission, had not been random. Juno's instincts told her that the plot went much deeper than they had originally suspected. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to stop the alliance. They were trying to unravel the very fabric of what it meant for humanity and the Thraxians to work together. As she lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling, Juno couldn't help but wonder, was their growing bond strong enough to withstand the forces that were conspiring against them? Could two cultures so different truly come together, or were they doomed from the start? The answers would not come easily, she knew. But for the first time, Juno felt a sense of clarity. There was a path forward, one that involved more than just technological solutions and military might. It involved trust, trust between humans and Thraxians, between her and Torak, and between the fragile alliance they were trying to build. And in the midst of all this uncertainty, Juno knew one thing for sure: the future of the Epsilon Horizon and its mission would depend on their ability to face the unknown together. And that was a challenge she was willing to accept.